You'll learn about a woman who was discovered lifeless under a pile of cat litter, a man who went by 5 different names, and a true crime geek who helped solve the case through a post made on Ancestry.com. One November day in 1985, a hunter was walking through Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, just doing whatever it is hunters do. He noticed a large metal drum that had been tipped over, and being the nosy hunter he decided to look inside. And that's when he was met with a shocking sight. 2 bodies that were wrapped up in plastic. Whoa, I bet he wasn't expecting that. Obviously, the hunter notified the police, and he was probably freaking out about the possibility of him being considered a suspect. Being nosy comes at a price. Shortly after the call was made, authorities arrived on site and began investigating the scene. But early on, they knew this was going to be a tough one to figure out. The bodies were so decomposed that they were basically just skeletons, and it was hard to find anything out about them. The only thing the investigators could really determine were the very basics. The victims were both women. One was an adult around 23 to 33 years old, and the other was a child somewhere between 5 to 11 years in age. It was believed that both victims had been slain sometime between 1977 and 1985, and whatever happened to them was brutal. That's a range of 8 years, which is pretty dang wide. If the crime was more recent, that might make things better for the investigation. But if it was 8 years earlier, that's a whole other beast. So one of the first things police officers thought to do was to sift through all of the missing persons reports that were filed in the New Hampshire area between the 70s and 80s. But of course, nothing is ever easy in the world of true crime, and no matches came up. Officers were still pretty certain that someone would come forward to report the 2 as missing, which would lead to their identification. Surely these 2 people had friends and family members who were missing them. Well, in 1986, the cops got a new lead. 1 year earlier, there was a woman named Grace who was reported as missing with her 5-year-old daughter, Gracie. I wonder where she drew inspiration for her daughter's name. Right off the bat, Grace and Gracie sounded just like the 2 victims found in the barrel. But after dental records were compared between Grace and her daughter and the 2 skeletons found at Bear Brook, detectives determined there was not a match. And back to the drawing board they went. Detectives tried and tried to identify these 2 poor victims, but after 18 months of hoping, the Allenstown police chief made the call to have the bodies buried. At that point, no one had reached out to identify the victims, and they were just sitting there at the morgue, so he knew it was time to lay them to rest. I can't wrap my brain around the fact that literally no one reported these 2 people as missing. It makes me wonder why that might be. Maybe the victims were involved in a sticky situation, so no one wanted to go to the police about it? Maybe they were from another country and weren't close with anyone in the US who would report them as missing. But still, I feel like the adult woman had to have a job or a house or something where people would notice her not showing up or paying her bills or something. I am confusion. America, explain. In the years following the burial, there were multiple sketches drawn up of the woman and child that were plastered all around the Northeast and Canada. Quite a few people in Allenstown actually thought the sketch of the woman resembled someone who used to live in their town. At the time, everyone thought that woman had just skipped town with their kids, but after hearing about the bodies in the barrel, it was theorized that this woman didn't move with her kids. Maybe she was taken, executed, and stuffed in the metal barrel, and the reason they weren't reported was because everyone thought she had moved. Detectives really thought they had it figured out, but they eventually located the woman in Arizona, where she and her children were alive and well. Which, good for this woman for being alive, but who are the people in the barrel? And that wasn't the only time investigators got their hopes up about being able to identify the woman and child. After the whole Grace and Gracie stunt, there was another mother-daughter duo who had vanished from a reservation in New Hampshire. Detectives were probably all like, this has to be them. How many mothers and daughters really go missing in New Hampshire? But again, they were proven wrong, and the two missing people were quickly located in Maine. As with most investigations involving unidentified people, the more time that passed, the harder it got to solve the case of the two Bear Brook victims. Every lead fell flat. There were no real witnesses, and there wasn't much evidence from the crime scene that helped determine anything at the time. And that's when detectives found out they weren't dealing with two victims. They were dealing with 4. Huh? So in 2000, 15 years after the first discovery, a state trooper went back to Bear Brook State Park to search the crime scene. He noticed another 55-gallon metal barrel that looked just like the one found by the hunter way back when. Obviously, he looked inside, and that's when he found 2 decomposed corpses. Deja vu, anyone? This metal drum was a bit further away from where the initial one was found. Some detectives hold the terrifying theory that the second barrel may have been pushed further away by kids who were playing in the area. Imagine playing in the woods as a kid and going about your day having absolutely no idea you rolled around some skeletons for fun. Well, I guess there's really no imagining to that one if they literally didn't know, but still, it's a crazy thought. Once the second barrel had been looked through, it was determined that there were 2 super young children. One was around 1 to 3 years old, the other was 2 to 4. Both were slain, cut up, and dumped just like the other 2 victims found in the 80s. All 4 were determined to have passed away from blunt force trauma. With that, investigators concluded both instances were related and the 4 victims were connected and named the Allenstown 4. Thanks to new DNA technology, authorities were able to determine that the adult woman and 2 of the 3 kids were related, which is when detectives presumed that they were dealing with a woman and her 2 daughters. But the identity of the 3rd child remained a mystery. While the media was going crazy over the new findings, investigators turned their focus to a trailer park that was near the discovery location of both barrels. This trailer park was known for hosting ex-convicts and transients, so it seemed like the perfect place to find a suspect in the case. But there were nearly 500 people who had passed through the trailer park during the time of the executions, so it was pretty much impossible to find out anything. Now let's fast forward to 2013. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children created new facial reconstructions of all 4 victims, and around that time, several organizations, private labs, and forensic scientists were conducting a bunch of tests to try and discover more information about the victims. From those tests, officials were able to determine that the woman, the youngest kid, and the oldest kid were from the same region, presumably New Hampshire. The middle kid was believed to be raised farther north. 2 years later, another set of facial reconstructions were made of the victims to showcase what they may have looked like in real life. And TBH, they were a bit creepy, but for 2015, these mock-ups were everything for this investigation. It was finally a way to put a face to the bodies found all those years ago. And maybe someone would be able to identify those slightly terrifying faces. No offense to the victims. They can't control that the people doing the reconstructions did them dirty. Let it be known that if I ever go missing and am found unidentified, those people better make me look good, or I will haunt them forever. Okay, but enough about my vanity. Let's get back to the investigation. With the new sketches and all the advancements of forensic testing, authorities concluded that the 4 victims had all lived in New Hampshire together for several months before they were slain, which detectives believed happened at once between the time frame of 1980 and 1984. Oh, so now it's a 4-year window. We're getting warmer. And in 2017, there was finally a breakthrough in the case. But it wasn't the identification of the victims, it was the identification of the suspect. And the way it all went down was kind of a coincidence. Here's how it happened. So in the 80s, there was a girl who was abandoned in an RV park. As she grew up, she started to wonder about her ancestry. She didn't really know where she came from or why her dad abandoned her, so she sought out answers. She took a DNA test to learn more about her ancestry, and that's when she found out she was the daughter of a woman named Denise. She also discovered the dude who abandoned her at the RV park wasn't her dad. They were completely unrelated. It turned out that the woman's mother, Denise, hadn't been seen since 1981, but she was never reported missing because there were a few things leading up to her disappearance that made her family assume she left town to start a new life on the down low. Denise was last seen on Thanksgiving in 1981 when she went to her parents' house for dinner with her boyfriend, Bob, and her 6-month-old daughter, Dawn. While Denise was never seen again, Dawn was taken by Bob. Bob then decided to go by the name Curtis, and he started calling Dawn Lisa. For years, he pretended to be her dad until he pawned her off with other people at an RV park. At that point, he had changed his name again to Gordon. Apparently, modern-day Lisa/Dawn, who now goes by another name, remembered being raised by this man with a few other kids who she assumed were her siblings. But get this, they all mysteriously passed away after eating grass mushrooms when they were out camping. Okay, what is going on here? Why are there so many new people popping up with so many different names? Anyway, Lisa/Dawn grew up and lived her adult life under a different name, barely knowing anything about her real past until she took that DNA test. Once all of those connections were made, officials ran tests to see if Denise was the adult woman discovered in the barrel, but she was not. Denise was officially reported missing in 2016, and she has yet to be found, although detectives have a bad feeling that Bob snuffed her. But if you couldn't already tell, Bob was a fake name, and the dude went by many names over the course of his career, including Gordon Jensen, Curtis Kimball, Jerry Mockerman, and Larry Vanner. Well, whatever this dude's name really was, it was discovered that he passed away in prison in 2010. In 2004, the perp, who I think was going by the name Larry at the time, admitted to the cat litter crime and was sentenced for 15 years to life in prison. When he was booked, all of his other aliases were discovered, so from that point on, he was most commonly referred to as Bob. As I mentioned earlier, Bob passed away in 2010, so he wouldn't be able to be interviewed, but his DNA could be tested. And after it was, officials concluded that the unidentified middle child from the Bear Brook case was actually Bob's son, who no one knew existed. And now I think I can officially say this is the most confusing story I've ever told. And not to be a letdown, but it's about to get even worse. Not only was this man related to one of the victims, it was also discovered that Bob was working as an electrician at a local mill during the time of the crimes. His boss actually owned the property where the remains were dumped, and the barrels they were found in were most likely from the mill. With all this new tea, detectives realized Bob was most likely the villain who rubbed out the barrel-bound victims. And after running a DNA test against one of Bob's other kids, it was determined that Bob's legal name was Terrence, or Terry Rasmussen. By then, everyone was so tired of keeping up with Terry's many names that he was dubbed the Chameleon Killer. And here's where things start to fall in place, or at least somewhat in place. In 2018, a multi-episode podcast was released by a New Hampshire public radio reporter who wanted to discuss and untangle the case of the Allenstown Four. It was downloaded over 11 million times, and out of those millions of listeners was a true crime sleuth, Rebecca. After hearing about the case, Rebecca was determined to uncover the identity of the 4 victims. She searched through message boards on Ancestry.com and found a post about a missing woman and child named Marlise Honeychurch and Sarah McWaters. Everything about Marlise and Sarah's disappearance lined up with the Bear Brook case, so Rebecca reached out to the person who made the original post to learn more. After talking to the relative, Rebecca found out that Marlise was last seen with a guy named Terry Rasmussen. And at that moment, I hope Rebecca started filling out an application to become an FBI agent, because homegirl just identified 2 of the victims from the metal barrels that detectives spent over 30 years trying to do. It was later discovered that Marlise had another child named Marie. In June of 2019, the official announcement was made that 3 of the Bear Brook victims were identified as Marlise Honeychurch and her 2 kids, Sarah McWaters and Marie Vaughn. Apparently, Marlise was dating Terry around the time she and her kids went missing in 1978 in La Puente, California. Which, I know it seems odd for this guy to be in Cali, but based on his many names, it wouldn't be strange for him to bounce around the whole US. And to spice things up even more, authorities found out Marlise and her kids went missing on Thanksgiving. If you've already forgotten, because Lord knows there are so many different details to keep up with in this case, Thanksgiving was the same exact day Denise disappeared 3 years later. What is it with this man? I get Thanksgiving is a screwed up holiday, but that doesn't mean you have to snatch up women out of spite. Basically, the last day Marlise was seen, she introduced her family to her new boyfriend, Terry. Sometime that night, she got into a fight with her mom and left with her new boo and her 2 girls. The details of what happened after that are unknown, but what we do know is Marlise and her kids were battered, slain, and dumped in a barrel. After the 3 victims were identified, an official funeral was held for them, and a new sketch of the 4th victim was made and released to the public. No further connections have been made in the process of finding out who that 4th girl was, other than the fact that she was Terry's kid. And considering his reputation, it seems like he may have a bunch of kids we don't know about. Well, that's the story of the Allenstown 4. As sad as it is that the one little girl still hasn't been identified, it's kind of a miracle that the other 3 were. And it was all thanks to a podcaster, a web sleuth, and a few other people and tests along the way. You know, I'm still shook over the fact that Terry literally got away with murder for all those years. And why did he keep taking his victims on Thanksgiving? That's just strange. But now I'm in the mood for Thanksgiving food, so I'm gonna nosh on this Wellington I just casually made. And after that, I might dig through the depths of the internet to see if I can solve the case of the 4th victim once and for all. See you next time!